Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove, and I hope you're having a very happy Christmas octave. Happy feast. Today is the feast of the Holy Innocents. Now, I want to talk about chapter 10 in the prophet Isaiah, just a few verses from chapter 10. One of the things about the prophet Isaiah is he's constantly issuing diatribes against Israel and Judah for their bad behavior. And they're going to be punished for this bad behavior. But in what exactly does this bad behavior consist? Well, chapter 1 gives us chapter 10, verse 1, and the next few verses gives us a very clear indication. God spells it out. Woe to those who enact unjust decrees, who compose oppressive legislation, to deny justice to the weak, and to cheat the humblest of my people of fair judgment, to make widows their prey, and to rob the orphan. Now, it's very, very specific here because he's saying that you pass legislation, you write down laws which are oppressive and are unjust. Now, the whole point of a law is that it should enact justice. A law, a statute, should be there to ensure that justice is done to all. Above all, justice and laws and statutes are there to protect the weak, to protect widows, and to protect orphans. But their statutes do the exact opposite. They're quite perverse. They enable one to persecute widows and to take advantage of orphans more easily than otherwise. In other words, the statutes that they enact empower the strong and disadvantage the weak, whereas it should be the other way around. They should control the strong and their violent impulses, and they should protect the weak and give the weak protection. Now, well, what are they talking about? It's hard to know what exactly these statutes are about. It might well have been something to do with money lending. That is one of my suspicions, because the widow and the orphan might well have been able to fall into the hands of powerful moneylenders and to be enslaved in that way. It might be something to do with the worship of the Baals and the practice of child sacrifice. It could well be that by countenancing child sacrifice, they could certainly be saying that they were oppressing the weak and denying justice to the humblest of my people. Nowadays, we live in a society where people have very poor impression of the law. The law, it says in every Italian courtroom, la legge è uguale per tutti. The law is equal for all of them, for everybody. In other words, the law imposes a level playing field. But of course, it doesn't really, because if you're very rich, you can get very good lawyers. And of course, you can go to lawfare with your enemies. There are quite a few quite famous people in Britain who do this on a regular basis. They're very handy with the writs, and they use their ability to sue other people less powerful than themselves, less influential than themselves. They use this threat of litigation to silence anybody who might criticize them. Again, the idea of getting a court order, which in theory anybody could get, I suppose, that's something that very few people get. Injunctions, super injunctions, and so on. These tend to favour those who really do know the system against those who don't really have any idea of the system. But what about the legislation passed by all our parliaments? On the face of it, these favour the poor in comparison with the rich, in the sense the poor are taxed less and the rich are taxed more. Everybody knows that. Although everybody pays the same VAT, don't they? The most appalling law of all is the laws that allow injustice to be done thanks to the law. The law that says you can take the life of an innocent human being in the first 6 months of gestation is not a just law. The law that says you are allowed to gender self-ID, I don't think is just either. This has not yet come into practice. These are things in which so many of us do dissent, and we must make our dissent clear. One of the things about these laws is, about any law in a liberal society, does depend on consent. That is to say, if I am subject to something, I must consent that I'm subject to this. So if I have to have my appendix taken out, I have to give my assent. The person in the womb who is about to be aborted cannot give their consent. Therefore, abortion is a fundamentally illiberal act. Again, if women do not consent to sharing women-only spaces with those who've got gender identification certificates and who were born not of women, then if they don't consent, that seems to me to be rather important. So, the law, is it just? This is what God is saying about the Israelites. You have created an unjust society. You have enacted laws. Instead of supporting the weak, you have victimized the weak. Well, God is going to punish them, and the king of Assyria is going to be God's rod. And here we have it in verse 5 of chapter 10. Woe to Assyria, rod of my anger, the club in their hands is my fury. God is going to use the Assyrians to punish the people of Judah, but God is not going to give the Assyrians any merit for doing this, because he realizes that the motives of the Assyrians are bad motives. So the Assyrians, they too will be punished for what they're doing, but what they're doing is in itself a punishment on Israel. One goes over to verse 20, God will eventually restore his people. When that day comes, he says, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will stop relying on the man who strikes them and will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. Israel, though your people are like sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. A destruction has been decreed, which will make justice overflow throughout the country. The Lord, God of Israel, God of hosts, will enforce the destruction now decreed. But some are going to be spared, and these who are going to be spared are the remnant. Now, this concept of the remnant is rather an interesting biblical concept. What does it mean? Well, it means the sinners are going to be put to death, the sinners are going to be destroyed. But some people who are not sinners are going to survive, and from them will come the rebuilding, the reflowering of Judah and Israel and the Jewish religion. So God is going to purify his people but the people will survive thanks to this remnant. Now, you could actually pick up quite a lot of theology in our own time from this idea of the remnant. Christians are very much in a minority in most countries. We are a remnant. Once there were lots and lots of Christians, now there are many, many fewer. For example, Britain, England in 1520 was a fervently Catholic country. 50 years later, there are about 30,000 Catholics left in England, a remnant. But this remnant was a faithful remnant, just like the remnant of which Elijah the prophet speaks, those who have not bowed Baal, those who have not kissed him. And from that remnant springs the Catholics that we have today. Those are the ones who kept the faith and who did not lose it and guaranteed its survival. But this time of being a remnant, which went for over 200 years, must have been a fairly grim time. The same is true in Japan. When the 19th century missionaries arrived in Japan, they discovered a faithful remnant of cultural Christians who had survived without any priests for several hundred years, ever since the Christianity was supposedly extirpated from the land. To be a remnant, to be faithful, to carry the torch for future generations, this, I think, is our task. And the great and good Pope Benedict XVI did talk about the church becoming smaller. And he said, as long as the church remains faithful, the smallness of the church won't matter too much. Now, I think or at least that's how it's usually interpreted. I think we always want a big church. We always want as many people as possible in the church. We shouldn't say, oh, there's hardly anybody here, let's rejoice. And we shouldn't have an elitist church, just a few people who are puro e duro, pure and hard, or pure and steadfast in their faith. Yes, we do want people who are steadfast in their faith, but we do want this faith to be shared with as many people as possible. But the truth of the matter is, if the falling away continues, and it certainly started, hasn't it? We, therefore, who remain true, must be even more true than we would otherwise be. That's the whole point. On us, it falls to keep the faith alive. And indeed, this tiny remnant that came back from exile, on them, when they got back to Jerusalem and saw everything in ruins, on them it fell to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the community, and to rebuild under God the faith. But the key thing is here, they will stop relying on the man who strikes them and will rely truly on the Lord. If we want to be a faithful remnant, we have to learn to rely on the Lord. And this is the constant message of Isaiah. Don't rely on men, rely on the Lord. In that day, the Lord alone shall be exalted, and not the king of Assyria, or the king of Judah, or the king of Israel. The Lord alone is our foundation. Okay, that's chapter 10 of Isaiah. All the best then. Bye.